Hey guys, it's Ben Beyond Repair here. Today I wanted to talk about trying to figure out what order you should actually be maxing your abilities in. And it's a more complicated question than a lot of people think. I think it's one of those things in League that gets really overlooked. But if you're playing a champion for a long time, you should probably, dive into and take a look at yourself. There's a lot of different ways that people max their abilities that are pretty unconventional. You see all the time champions where people are putting 3 points into an ability, especially on support, into one of their damaging abilities, and then maxing an ability that is better once you're around multiple people, like more of a utility spell. Or you see champions like Tryndamere where people at a high level are really only putting 1 point into the ult and then maxing their other things out first because they believe that the benefit they get from continuing to put those other points into other abilities outweighs what they gain from putting more points into their ult. And then we also have situations where throughout the years, champions like Thresh, we've seen people max different abilities at different points almost arbitrarily. Like people have just kind of switched their preference on what to max over the years. And so I think that, he's a champion that's worth taking a look at. And then champions as well, like Leona or Alistar, but this applies to all other roles who will end up maxing abilities in a certain order to try to get two abilities on the same cooldown. In order to enable them to combo quicker. So, if you've got two abilities, obviously, that really need to be used at the same time, like Alistar Q and Alistar W or Leona EQ, trying to get those cooldowns synced with each other is really important because you're essentially waiting on the longer cooldown to use the other one most of the time. And so being able to have both up at the same time is really powerful. So if we take a look right at some of these examples here, one of the reasons why people only choose to put 1 point into Tryndamere ult is because the only benefit that you get really from putting it in is you can see that like he's going to have a shorter cooldown if he puts points into his ult. The fury that he'll gain will go up a little bit, and he'll have a little bit, but not much more minimum health threshold, meaning that it'll activate and then he'll be able to keep that 70 HP no matter what, so that when he comes out, he has a little bit more HP to work with. But realistically, you're probably all-inning on Tryndamere when you have a bunch of Fury anyways, especially if you're at the point where you're dying. And the minimum health threshold, only being 20 health per point that you put in really doesn't make almost any difference at all. And the cooldown could be considered big, but the problem is that most of the time you're playing around the ult's cooldown anyways, and the advantage that you can get even from throwing points into like a W or something like that later on, but especially, like at level 11, instead of putting a second point into ult, being able to get like another point into, into your other abilities is just more powerful than the benefit that you get from, being able to use your ult another 20 seconds earlier. When you're going to play around that cooldown anyways, and not need to use it on cooldown. So that's, kind of what's going on with Tryndamere here, and there are probably other champions like that, probably more than we know about, but people, again, I think it's one of the most autopiloted things is what abilities are you going to max. We talked about Alistar and Leona and comboing, and we can see that, Alistar has a 14 to 10 second cooldown on Q, and he's got a 14 to 10 second cooldown on W. So part of the problem here is that if you're maxing one of these abilities straight outright, you're going to get a 10 second cooldown on one and a 14 second on the other one. Of course, you're going to have cooldown reduction, but that's going to affect both of them. But the point is that if you just max one outright before the other one, you're going to end up with them being off sync, and you don't really want that to be the case. So you'd maybe rather even alternate between putting points in with a champion like Leona, especially because if we look at the other things that we get, we're getting like 40 damage here per point into Q, and here we're getting what is this, 55 in W. So not much of a big difference in damage. In fact, we're getting more damage from W. So, and then the mana cost going up by the same amount, which is very small thing, but that's the only difference. So, I mean, maybe when you look at these objectively, being able to alternate points between these two would be better than just maxing one outright so that you can WQ combo more often. Champion like Leona even, her Q is always a flat 5-second cooldown. Most people max W on Leona first, but let's say that you want to max W on Leona, and then after that, since your Q is on a 5-second cooldown, it's really nice to get her E down to the 6-second cooldown here, because once you get it down to 6 seconds, you're going to have nearly the same time on the EQ cooldown as you would on just the Q cooldown. And a lot of times in fights, you're not necessarily going to be able to just walk at somebody on the enemy team and Q them over and over again, even if you have no E. So being able to continuously EQ faster, is really important and maybe worth considering. So there's champions like Leona and Alistar where we're trying to match certain combos and the cooldowns on them. But what goes into, like, why would we max a certain ability, and what are we looking for most of the time when we're looking at how much value am I gaining from a point? A lot of times when you're maxing an ability, the main thing that you're looking for is it reducing the cooldown of the ability. That's really, really important, because it can often be quite a big reduction on a very important ability. You're also trying to think about, like, what ability is really enabling my champion to succeed. So kind of in the same way that when we're looking at a Leona or an Alistar, we're thinking about their combos and getting those to be more efficient or faster. We're thinking about the same thing with any champion. So, like, when we look at Braum, for example, what abilities, really cause Braum to be powerful and do his job and affect the outcome of games. And really it's his passive and it's his E that are probably the most important here for Braum. Now, the Q is a little bit complicated because, of course, his Q is also going to apply his passive, and it's his way to apply passive from range. So it's quite important because of that as well. So that's not to say that, you do one or the other, but let's just take a look here at Braum as an example, my main champion, because I think that it's a lot closer between maxing Q and E than people think, and probably almost down to your preference. But I don't think people bother to really think about that. And so we'll go through some examples here. And while we're looking at a lot of support examples, because these are abilities and champions that I'm super familiar with for talking about this, keep in mind that you're looking for the same stuff for the most part in any role with any champion that you're looking to maximize your ability. You're just looking to maximize the utility that you're getting out of putting that point into your ability. And so sometimes you're going to want to reconsider, what do I actually get? Do I know what I actually get when I put a point into my ult? Do I know what I actually get when I'm putting a point into my ability? Is there a scenario where I start maxing something different once I'm out of lane versus when I'm in lane that would benefit me more in team fights or benefit me more only in lane? Are there abilities where I'm getting cooldown off for maxing one ability, but not getting cooldown off for maxing another ability? Is there a key ability that I'm able to get a lot of cooldown off of, or something like that I can use way more frequently if I max it than something else? Especially if you're playing a damaging role, am I getting more damage? And is the amount of damage that I'm getting plus the increased damage I'm getting from the cooldown being lower, because you're going to be able to use your ability to damage them more often, is that combination of cooldown reduction and damage worth what I'd get from maxing some other damaging ability or some other ability that provides utility or something else entirely? And that's really important to keep in mind. So Braum's a good example because it forces us to think about, again, how is damage compared to damage mitigated? It makes a big difference because when you do 75 magic damage, for example, on Braum Q, really that's going to be cut in half, because most of the time, and it depends and changes throughout the game, but most of the time people are going to reduce about 50% of physical damage and about 50% of magic damage with their armor and their magic resist. Now, for some champions that are squishier, it's going to be less. For some champions that are tankier, it's going to be more. Obviously, early in the game, it's going to be less, and later in the game, it's going to be more. But you have to keep in mind that if something says it's going to do 100 damage, it's really probably only going to do about 50 damage on average throughout a game. And that's kind of the way that I like to think about it. Whereas if you have, 30% damage reduction, that's mitigating damage that you would have taken kind of, post. So if they're dealing 100 damage to you, you're mitigating 30% of that. That's 30, just the way that it is. So you don't need to kind of cut that in half. So that's kind of important to keep in mind. Because of this, right, when we look at like an ability like Braum Q and an ability like Braum E, we can identify that, well, Braum Q can be really important for the unique attribute that it has, that you're able to apply his passive and apply it from range, and his passive is very important to the champion's success. Maxing E, if you think about it, E is the more impactful ability for sure. And you get 2 seconds off of the cooldown for each point that you put into E, whereas you only get half of a second off for each point that you put into Q. We get an increase of 50 magic damage, which again is probably only going to do about 25 magic damage. So I just ran some numbers to try to get kind of a break-even point. And with Braum E, if you take 200 damage, you're going to, for each point that you put in, reduce an extra 5%. So if you take 200 damage during a Braum E, you're going to reduce an extra 10 damage because of the damage reduction that you get just from that 1 point. It also increases the duration of his E by 1/4 of a second. And if we think about, well, how long is 3.25 seconds compared to 3 seconds, it's an extra 8.33%. And so if we think about blocking an extra, if the damage was evenly spread out throughout his E, if we think of blocking an extra 8.33% damage, that'd be another 16.66 damage. So then we're at 26 or 27. So we're actually mitigating more damage with Braum E than we're doing with Braum Q. If the target has that we're attacking has 50% magic damage reduction, and we're only taking 200 damage with E. Of course, if we take less damage during the course of our E, that won't be as good. If we take more damage during our E would be even better. That additional point would be even better. And this isn't really even taking into account the cooldown, right? One thing that's important to keep in mind about cooldown, though, as well, it's important, like I said with the Tryndamere ult, which gives cooldown, but people play around it. Braum doesn't really want to just spam E, especially because it's good at blocking certain projectiles or really dealing with certain abilities. A lot of times you're trying to hold the ability for just the right moment, and so getting it to a shorter cooldown may not necessarily be that good. Whereas it's almost always okay to be fishing for Q so that you can apply passive to somebody from range in a team fight to enable the other people who are fighting on your team to do more in a fight. And so there is a difference there in that, even in lane, you can spam Q for poke a little bit. Obviously more in a liberal way than you would with E. You're able to just use the Q whenever you feel like. So E is definitely an ability that you're holding more often anyways, so maybe you're not getting as much benefit from the cooldown. But just straight up in terms of damage versus damage reduction, you're seeing very even numbers between Braum E and Braum Q. So I'm not saying you should go out and max Braum E. I personally still max Q, although I've definitely leaned more towards, and this is something we wanted to talk about on support, like a lot of supports like a Karma or something like that are going to put more like 3 points into Q or max Q while they're in lane, but then switch to maxing E once they're out of lane, because in lane they're using Mantra Q, ult Q on Karma, they're poking, they're doing damage. Same thing with Braum, right? You're using Q to do damage, to fish for engages, but you're having to hold E. But then later in the game, in team fights and stuff like that on Karma, you're able to transition into the mid game to providing more utility for your team and not needing to poke as much or do any damage in fights. And so because you're just sitting back and hardly ever using Q, and you're spamming your E and your ult E, for Karma to shield your whole team, you get a lot more benefit out of applying that bigger shield to 4 or 5 people in a fight than you would from getting an additional point or 2 into your Q. So I'm starting to think that on Braum you should be doing something similar, where maybe you put points into Q to do extra damage during all-ins in laning phase, but then you transition to maxing E when you're needing to have that up more often, have a shorter cooldown, be more forgiving, and to block more damage, frankly, than you would deal with Q later on. But I mean, there are some tough breaking points with that. Like, there is a really big breaking point for Braum where his passive lasts long enough that you can Q twice during a passive duration. That makes Braum really effective, because even if your team is having a really hard time catching up to somebody or they're far, being able to Q them twice to keep that passive going, and to make sure, like, if they get hit with Q twice while your passive's up on them, they're definitely going to get stunned. But you don't get to that point until you're high enough level that your passive lasts longer, and you have enough cooldown reduction that your Q is lower even while maxing it. So I suppose you'd get to that break point later. So it gets quite complicated, but it's a lot more complicated, right, than people think. And I think a lot of people, even on their main champion, kind of neglect to ever reconsider or to go back and evaluate, what value am I getting from blocking damage with Braum? What value am I getting from hitting someone with Braum Q? Is there an argument to be made for maxing it? Should I be putting 3 points into Q and then maxing E? That sort of thing. And Thresh, I think, is a great example to kind of round it out, because Thresh as a champion, I haven't personally taken a look at very closely, but I know that people have switched from maxing E in order to poke to maxing Q. People were maxing W at one point, but things have been changed around the way that his abilities work over the years. And so I'm sure that, the cooldown benefit that he's gotten from certain abilities has changed. But I've always thought that it was funny that Thresh players kind of so arbitrarily switched from maxing their ability to maxing another one, sometimes even though there was no change. And so it's one of these examples of where, I think Thresh players back in the day really did use to max E, and now all of a sudden everyone maxes Q. And there was a period of time where I think his W was broken and people maxed his W. But just the fact that he's switched back and forth so many times, but if you ask, like, your average player, even your average Thresh player, like, why do you max Q versus E? I don't really know that they could tell you. So if we take a look at Thresh, it looks like we're getting a couple of seconds off of the Q cooldown. So we're getting 2.5, it looks like, 2.5 seconds off of the Q cooldown for every point in it, which results in it going all the way from 19 down to 9, which is nice. And the magic damage goes up by 50 for every point that we put into it. So we're getting 2.5 seconds off of the Q cooldown, and we're getting 50 magic damage, for every point that we put into it. Now, he does have a thing, I believe, where if he hits somebody, it reduces the cooldown. Catches the first enemy hit to deal magic damage and reveal them. It reduces the current cooldown by 2 seconds. Yeah, so if he hits something with this Q, it'll reduce the cooldown by 2 seconds. So that's a little bit important to keep in mind, because that obviously has more of an impact if it's a longer cooldown, but not really that big of a deal. So then on W, we get 1 second off W at all ranks. And the shield strength goes up by 20. So obviously you probably wouldn't max W, because you're going to play around the W cooldown more than you would around the Q cooldown. So if you're in a team fight on Thresh, you're going to be spamming Q more than you're going to be like spamming W. You don't really spam W. You want to, in fact, hold it more than most players hold it, so that you always have it at the key moment when someone actually needs the lantern out. So getting cooldown on W doesn't really do a whole lot. And the shield only going up by 20 as opposed to having 50 magic damage is not as big. Now, of course, we could keep in mind, just like we said on Braum, that an extra 50 magic damage really means more like an extra 25. And the shield going up by 20 is pretty similar to that, I guess, in that regard. But obviously, I would still prefer to max Q here. W also increases the mana cost while Q doesn't, which is very minor because, again, you're going to play around your mana, but, that's interesting. So the E, if you max E, you get 0.75 seconds off of the cooldown, but I think most of the reason why people use to max E anyways is for the damage. So let's take a look here. So you're also getting, when you put points into E, what is this, 45 magic damage on the ability itself. So an extra 45 magic damage on the ability itself. And then it does not look like it's increasing his auto attack damage. You have minimum and maximum bonus magic damage per soul, but this is like maximum bonus 1.5 per soul collected plus 80 to 200% AD. So I think when you put points into it, I think this does mean that it goes from an 80% AD ratio to a 200% AD ratio. So how much does that actually mean? So let's say we had like 70 AD on Thresh. That would be, towards the start of the game, maybe as you get a couple of levels, something like that. If you had like 70 AD, the difference between 80% of that would be, well, let's just make the math easier. Let's say you had 100, you'll probably have a little bit less than that. If you had 100, you'd get an extra 80 if you just have the 1 point into it, but then you'd get an extra 120, and then this is going up by 30%. So if you had 100 AD, you'd be getting an extra 30 damage when you're doing that. Maybe this isn't per point that you put into it. Maybe this is actually just the longer you've been holding it. Yeah, that actually makes more sense. So I think this is not for putting a point into it, right? This is the longer you hold it, right? It's different colors on the E as you charge it up. So yeah, you only get the 45 magic damage, which is less than Q, and you're reducing less of the cooldown. You do get the slow to go up from 20 to 40%, but that's not that big of a deal. And again, if we think about what Thresh's key ability is, it's clearly his Q. So for those reasons, you'd probably max Q. And then are you going to max E second, or are you going to max W second? That's a little bit more complicated because the damage versus the shielding is a little bit closer. And I would argue that Thresh's W is more important than Thresh's E. For sure. But yeah, I mean, that becomes a little bit of a complicated question. Probably for me, looking at this, I would probably decide to max W second, but it could depend on how often, it could depend on the game, how often you feel like you're able to get Flays off in that game. So anyways, I hope this was helpful, right? Just make sure you're looking at your champion and kind of reevaluating what you're maxing on them, because I think it can actually be quite nuanced. And I think a lot of people overlook this one. And there's a lot of weird combinations or second, abilities that people could max instead of their first one that they've just never, done the cost benefit on it. So hope that you guys found this helpful. Good luck in solo queue and have a wonderful day.